Windows 365 is a brand new service from Microsoft that delivers personal PCs running in the cloud as a service. And if you think that sounds familiar, then yes, that is also what Azure Virtual Desktop does, but Windows 365 does this in a much simpler manner in terms of administration, provisioning, cost management, and so on. Once you have everything set up and running, all you really need to do in order to provision new machines to your users is a matter of assigning them a license. Does that sound too good to be true? Well, it's actually not, and in this video I'll go through what Windows 365 is, what value it can bring to you as an admin, what value it can bring to your users, why Windows 365 might not be for you, a little bit of something about the requirements and licensing around it, and one thing that Microsoft does not mention a whole lot, the differences between Windows 365 Business and Windows 365 Enterprise. As I mentioned before, Windows 365 provides personal PCs running in the cloud. Your users will then connect to these PCs either through a client on their device or through their web browser. What this means for your users is that no matter where in the world they are, or from whatever device they are accessing Windows 365 from, everything will be exactly the same. They will access the same PC with the same apps, the same settings, and the same files. Everything will be exactly the same. You can, for example, be sitting at work doing your thing, then suddenly your wife calls with some emergency or whatnot, and then you just have to go straight back home. With Windows 365, you can then pick up from where you left off from your home computer or your iPad or your phone or whatever. Everything will then be exactly as it were when you left off. This also goes for traveling, for example. You can work from Detroit and then hop on a plane and continue from London, or even do some work on your way there, since Windows 365 works on nearly any device out there. Another benefit for your users is that performance will be persistent across devices and locations. Basically, if you can stream a movie from Netflix, then you can use Windows 365 and your experience will be the same. Did I mention that Windows 365 devices have an internet connection of 10 gigabits? But for admins, Windows 365 brings even more value to the table. Both the management part and the security part is much simpler than with physical devices or even other VDI platforms. Windows 365 devices, or Cloud PCs as they're called, are managed through Microsoft Endpoint Manager, or MEM for short. And if you're already using MEM for management of your other devices, then you will be using the same familiar portals to manage Windows 365. And since they are managed through MEM, you can use the endpoint security capabilities of MEM to secure your Cloud PCs, and you can also use conditional access to secure the access to and from your Cloud PCs. Alright, enough hallelujah, let's talk about why Windows 365 might not be the right choice for your company. And first of all, since your Cloud PCs will be running in an Azure data center, anything depending on local infrastructure will be slower than if you were running things locally. That means that if your users are primarily working with files that are stored on local file servers, NAS equipment, and other storage things, or they are working on databases that are hosted locally, then those users will probably not be happy with Windows 365, as it will be probably slower due to latency issues. Those kind of issues can be mitigated if you were just to migrate all the things over to Azure, but there are things that cannot be migrated, like 3D printers, scanners, manufacturing equipment, and so on. Besides, should really Windows 365 be your main reason for migrating to Azure? Also, since Windows 365 is a cloud-based solution, then you are dependent on a stable internet connection. Now, it doesn't have to be that fast, and like I said, if you can stream a movie from, say, Netflix, then you are good to go. But if you have a lot of packet loss, or if the speed often dips way down, then Windows 365 might not provide the best user experience. And that eliminates any use case where your users are located in very remote places, places where the only access to internet is through mobile networks with poor reception, and so on. With that out of the way, let's talk about something that at least I feel that Microsoft has not communicated all that well, and that is that Windows 365 comes in two different flavors. You have the business version and you have the enterprise version. Now, it's not a big surprise that this is the case, because Office 365 and Microsoft 365 has, well, always been in business and enterprise, but as far as I've seen, all the marketing material that has been coming from Microsoft these days have been focused on the enterprise version of Windows 365. And the requirements and features of the two are pretty different. And as with Microsoft 365, the business version is limited to 300 users and offers, well, little to no enterprise features. But it also means that with the business version, it's so much simpler to get started. So let's compare the two versions, starting with the requirements and the initial setup. Windows 365 Business offers a click to provision directly from the product page. It also doesn't have the requirement for a traditional Active Directory like, for example, Azure Virtual Desktop has. And these two features means that getting started is just super simple. It's a matter of purchasing licenses and assigning those licenses, and you are good to go. With Windows 365 Enterprise, on the other hand, the setup process is a little more work, and unlike the business version, you actually have some requirements. So let's start by looking at the requirements. First of all, your users will have to have a license that includes Windows on it. That means that you can use the Microsoft 365 F3, E3, E5, or the Microsoft 365 Business Premium. Alternatively, you can, for users that will have a Windows Pro endpoint, you can use the Windows 10 Enterprise E3 license combined with an EMS E3 license. Or if your users will have a non-Windows Pro endpoint, whatever that means, you can use the Windows VDI E3 license together with an EMS E3 license. Now, did you spot what all these alternatives have in common? Well, they all include Intune. That is because to use Windows 365 Enterprise, you need to have Intune supported licenses. Your tenant also needs to have an Azure subscription with a VNet in it, and from that VNet, there needs to be routing to a DNS server that can resolve Active Directory records for your domain. That's right, Windows 365 Enterprise requires you to have a traditional Active Directory that is in sync with Azure AD, and you also need to have hybrid joining set up and working. Once you have those requirements in place, you need to create an on-premise network connection and a provisioning policy in Endpoint Manager. And before you ask, no, that on-prem network connection is not a connection or a VPN to your on-prem. You need to supply that on your own. The on-prem network connection is simply a policy that defines what kind of credentials are used to be joining your devices or your cloud PCs to your traditional Active Directory. And once you have that in place, the next step is to assign the Windows 365 licenses to your users. So as you can see, the setup process and requirements are vastly different between Windows 365 Business and Windows 365 Enterprise. There is also a ton of differences in the feature sets for Business and Enterprise. So let's look at the feature set for Windows 365 Enterprise. You have self-service upgrades, you have universal print integration, you have custom images, image management, MEM integration, and the full use of MEM features, endpoint analytics, reporting and monitoring. You can connect your cloud PCs to your on-prem environment, and so on. Windows 365 Business, on the other hand, has none of these. One thing that isn't that much of a difference between the Business and Enterprise version is the costs. So let's move on to costs, shall we? Windows 365 costs are mostly based on licenses, and those licenses dictates the specs of the cloud PCs you get. Much like the size of the virtual machines in Azure dictates the specs you get there. Say, if you want to provide a user with a cloud PC that has 2 vCPUs, 4 gigs of RAM and 64 gigs of storage, then you simply purchase the license for those specs and assign it to the user. But for Enterprise Windows 365, you will have to pay for bandwidth usage on your VNet in addition to this. Business does not have this additional cost, but on the other hand, with Windows 365 Business, you have an outbound data volume limit. The licenses are pretty similar between the Business and the Enterprise versions of Windows 365, apart from the fact that with Business, you have an option not to use hybrid benefit, and this will add a $4 cost to your license. Now, the requirements for using hybrid benefit and thus saving those $4 are simply a matter of accessing Windows 365 from a device that has a Windows Pro license on it at least once for each subscription term. And that's pretty much it for costs around Windows 365. It's really that simple. Now, is Windows 365 worth it? Well, as most things, it depends. I can certainly see use cases where Windows 365 is a great fit, like if you want to go full on bring your own device but still maintain security of your data, or if you want the least amount of hassle and costs tied to the end user equipment for your users, you can supply them with thin clients and have them use Windows 365 instead. However, there are still use cases where I think Windows 365 is not a great fit. I mentioned a couple of them earlier in the video, but in addition to those, you have cases where Azure Virtual Desktop is a better fit than Windows 365. For example, every use case where you want to have multiple users sharing the same virtual machine. Also, if you're not already using Microsoft 365 and features like the AD Connect or the Endpoint Manager, introducing Windows 365 Enterprise might also introduce some pains to your environments, since now we would have to manage those features as well. If you found this video helpful, please leave a like and consider subscribing if you want to catch my next video, where I will put Windows 365 head-to-head up against Azure Virtual Desktop and see who comes out on top. And yeah, other than that, see ya!